Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi everyone. We are from group 2 and they are me, Wiwinda Lestari, and Dikki, Ansar, Romanza, Fiola, Angelina, Chandra, Putri, Carbelani, Azzahra. Also there is Verdy, Rambu, Riwanda. And right now, I would like to show you our presentation that's about the Norman Conquest and the subjection of English. 166 until 1200. And on the first material, right, and the first material that's gonna explain by me, that's the Norman Conquest. Toward the close of the close of the Old English period, on events occurred that had a greater effect on the English language than any other in the course of its history. This event was the Norman Conquest in 1066. What the language would have been like if William the Conqueror had not succeeded in making good his claim to the English throne can only be a matter of conjecture. It would probably have pursued much the same of course as the other Germanic language, retaining perhaps more its inflection and the preserving a predominantly Germanic vocabulary, adding to its work stock by the characteristic method of word formation already explained, and it probably have pursued much the same course as the other Germanic languages, retaining perhaps more of its inflection and preserving a predominantly Germanic vocabulary, adding to its word stock by the characteristic languages much less freely. In particular, it would have lacked the greater part of the enormous number of French words that today make English seem, on the side of vocabulary, almost as much a Romance as a Germanic language. The Norman Conquest changed the word course of the English language. An event of such far-reaching consequences must be considered in some detail. And then the origin of the Normandy. Well, the next there is the origin of Normandy. On the northern coast of France, directly across from England, is a district extending some 75 miles back from the Channel and known as Normandy. It derived its name from the bands of Norsemen who settled there in the 9th and 10th centuries. At the same time that similar bands were settling in the north and east of England. The saying over a convenient channel from penetration into the country, and the settlement of Danes in the region furnished a close parallel to those around the Humber. A generation after Alfred reached an agreement with the Northmen in England, a somewhat similar Charles the Simple, King of France, in 612. The right of the Normans to occupy this part of France was recognized. Rollo acknowledged the French king as an overlord and became the first Duke of the Normans. In the following century and a half of succession of masterful dukes rises the dukedom to a position of a great influence, overshadowing at times the power of the King of France. The adaptability of the Scandinavian always a mark of characteristic of people, nowhere saw itself more quickly, widely adopting the ideas and customs of those among whom they come to live. The Norman had soon absorbed the most important element of French civilization. Moreover, they injected fresh figure into what they borrow. They provide from their contact with French military force and adding French tactics to their own impetuous courage. Soon had one of the best armies, if we may use the term, in Europe. They took important features of Frankish law, including the idea of the jury, and with a genius for organization that showed up as clearly in the Norman kingdom of Sicily as the Normandy, and later in England, make it one of the construction of those great Norman cathedrals that are still marvels to the modern architect. But most important of all, for us, they soon gave up their own language and learned French. So rapidly did they all Scandinavian tongue disappear in the Norman capital that the second Duke was forced to send his son to Bayeux so that we might learn something of the speech of his forefathers. In the 11th century, at the time of the Norman Conquest, the civilization of Normandy was essentially French, and the Normans were among the most advanced and progressive of the peoples Europe. For some years before the Norman Conquest, the relation between England and Normandy had been fairly close. In 1002, Aethelred the Unready had married in a Norman wife and when driven into exile by the Danes, took refuge with his brother-in-law, the Duke of Normandy. His son Edward, who had thus been brought up in a French, was almost more French than English. At all events, when in 1042 the Danish line died out and Edward, known as the Confessor, was restored to the throne from which his father had been driven. He brought with him a number of his Norman friends, enriched them, and gave them important places into the government. A strong French atmosphere pervaded the English court during the 24 years of the reign. Okay, the next material gonna explained by my friends. It's the year 1066. Thank you.
Okay, I will continue the explanation from my friends. So the material is about the year 1066, when King Edward died childless and Harold becomes king. Harold itself is the son of the influential nobles of Earl of the West Saxon earldom, becomes Edward's advisor. So Edward chose Harold, son of Godwin, becomes Earl after his father's death. His election did not long go unchallenged. William, the Duke of Normandy at this time, was a second cousin to the late king. He had been living in expectation of becoming Edward's successor. While William had been on a brief visit in England, Edward had assured him that he should succeed him. Even Harold had been led, though unwillingly, to acknowledge his claim. William himself is greatly strengthened in position and admirably schooled for the final test of his fortune. William the Great, as the chroniclers called him, was not the man to relinquish a kingdom without a struggle. He lost no time in beginning preparations. He secured the cooperation of his vassals by the promise of liberal rewards, and England was his to dispose of. As a result of this inducement, a lot of people flocked to his banner from all over France and even other parts of Europe. So in September, William landed at Pevensey in the south coast of England. His landing was unopposed. Harold was occupied in the north of England, meeting an invasion by the King of Norway, another claimant to the throne, who had been joined by a brother of Harold's, Tostig. Hardly had Harold triumphed in battle over the invade when word reached him of William's landing. Next slide, please. He called upon his brothers the previous, yes. He called upon his brothers-in-law in the earldom of Mercia and Northumbria to join him and repel the foreigner by a united effort, but they hung back. Nevertheless, hurrying south with his army, Harold finally reached a point between the Norman host and London. He drew up his force on a broad hill at Senegal, not far from Hastings, and awaited William's attack. For William himself, the situation was becoming desperate, and he resorted to a desperate stratagem. Because he could not drive them off, the England, he determined to try to lure him off, and ordered by a feigned retreat. The English fell into the trap. Thinking the Normans were really fleeing, a part of the English army started in crusade, intending to cut them down in their flight. But the Normans made a stand, and the battle was renewed on more even terms. And there's an incident where Harold was killed during the battle. And finally, the English capitulated on Christmas Day 1066. William was crowned King of England. Next. So we move to the Norman settlement. William's victory at Hastings and his subsequent coronation in London involved more than a mere substitution of one monarch or another. One of the most important of these consequences was the introduction of new nobility, or the French. This protest was repeated several times during the next 4 years while the conquest was being completed. For William's coronation did not win immediate recognition throughout England. He was in fact acknowledged only in the southeast. Upon his return from a visit to Normandy the following year, he was faced with a serious rebellions in the southwest, the west, and the north. As a result, this campaign, the Old English nobility was practically wiped out. In 172, only one of the 12 earls in England was an Englishman, and he was executed 4 years later. For several generations, after the conquest, the important positions and the great states were almost always held by Norman or men of foreign blood. In 172, only one of the 12 years. In 175, 13 of the 21 abbots who signed this decrees of the Council of London were English. 12 years later, their number had been reduced to 3. Foreign monks and priests followed the example of their superiors and sought the greater opportunities to advancement that England now offered. Next. So we enter the use of French by the upper class. For the 200 years after the Norman Conquest, French remained the language of ordinary intercourse among the upper class in England. At first, those who spoke in French were those of Roman origin, but soon through intermarriage and association with the ruling class, numerous people of English extraction must have found it to their advantage to learn the new language. And before long, the distinction between those who spoke French and those who spoke English was not ethnic, but largely social. I think that's all from me, and the next explanation will be continued by my friends.
Okay, thank you, Fiola. I will continue the material about circumstances promoting the continued use of French. From the time of the conquest, the kings of England were likewise dukes of Normandy. Not only was he buried there, but in dividing his possession at his death, he gave Normandy to his eldest son and England to William, his second son. Upon the accession of Henry II, English possessions in France were still further enlarged by his marriage with Eleanor of Aquitaine, he came into possession of vast estate in the south, so that when he became king of England, he controlled about two-thirds of France, all the western part of the country, from the English to the Pyrenees. Under the circumstances, it's not surprising that the attention of the English should often be focused upon affairs in France. Indeed, English kings often spend a great part of their time there. When we remember that, except for Henry I, no English king until Edward IV sought a wife in England, it's easy to see how continentally minded English royalty was and how natural anything would seem the continued use of French at the English court. The English nobility was not so much a nobility of England as an Anglo-French aristocracy. Nearly all the great English landowners had positions likewise on the continent, frequently contracted continental marriages, and spent much time in France, either in pursuance of their own interests or those of the king. A history of the English language, the continued use of French by those concerned, not only natural but inevitable. Next. And then the next part is the attitude toward English. The idea that the newcomers were actively hostile to the English language is without foundation. 16th, it's true that English was now an uncultivated tongue, the language of socially inferior class, and that a bishop like Wulfstan might be subjected to Norman disdain in part at least because of his ignorance of that social symbol. According to the same chronicler, 18 William the Conqueror made an effort himself at the age of 43 to learn English, that he might understand and render justice in the disputes between his subjects. But his energies were too completely absorbed by his many other activities to enable him to make much progress. There is nothing improbable in the statement. Certainly, the assertion of the 14th century writer 19 that the conqueror considered how he might destroy the Saxon tongue, in order that English and French might speak the same language, seem little less than silly in view of the king's effort to promote the belief that he was the authentic successor of the old English kings, and in the light of his use of English alongside of Latin to the exclusion of French in his charters. 20th later kings. 16 on this subject, see the excellent discussion in Shelley, English and French in England. Okay, I think that's all from me. And then the next material will be continued by my friends.
I am going to talk about French literature and English court. Body of writing in Old French used in medieval English. For example, schools, universities, parliament, and law. How completely French was the English court at this time is clearly shown by the literature produced for royal and noble patronage. And it is interesting to find a considerable body of French literature being. We do not know much about the literary conditions at the court of the conqueror himself, although his daughter Adela was a patron of poets, and his son Henry I, whether or not foreign poets. 24th, for Adelaide of Louvain, his second wife, David related to the work is lost, but we know of it from the statement of a contemporary poet, Putri, Geoffrey Gaimard, who boasted that he knew more tales than David ever knew or than Adelaide had in books. There are some popular types of literature in this era, like chronicles, religious and didactic writing, poetry and drama were the popular forms of writing. Next, please. Next slide. Okay, the second one, fusion of the two peoples. When a distinction is made, it soon comes to be between the English, meaning all people of England, and the French, meaning the inhabitants of French. This early fusion of French and English in England is quite clear from a variety of evidences. It is evident in marriage of Normans to English women, as when Robert D'Oyly further enriched himself by marrying Edith, the daughter of a great English landowner, or when the parents of Orderic Vitalis, already mentioned, were united. It is evident from the way in which the English gave their support to their rulers when Norman relates, as when William II and Henry I drove off foreign invaders with armies made up almost wholly of English troops, or when Anselm and Becket found their staunchest supporters among the English. In the towns of the associations, incident to trade are spoken of by Orderic Vitalis as another factor in bringing about a union between of the two peoples. The fusion seems to have gone forward rapidly in the reign of Henry I, and by the end of the 12th century, an English jurist was able to write, "Now that the English and Norman have been dwelling together, marrying and giving in marriage, the two nations have become so mixed that it is scarcely possible today. Speaking of Freeman, the to tell who is English, who of Norman race. Only the events of the next century, the loss of Normandy and the growing antagonism toward France were necessary to complete the union, psychological as well as a cycle, of all the inhabitants of England. Next slide, please. Okay, the last one is the division of English and French. From time to time, writers of the period tell us that such a one spoke both French and English, or that he was ignorant of one or the other language. Books and treatises such as Ancrin Rail and the various 13th century works on husbandry. When we know the individuals for whom they were written, or the social class, at least to which they belong, shed some light on the problem. In the 14th century, poets and writers often preface their works with an explanation of the language employed, and accidentally indulge from time to time in valuable observations of a more general linguistic nature. From all this accumulated testimony, the situation can be easily enough stated in general terms, as indeed has already been done. French was the language of the court and the upper classes, English the speech of the mass of the people. Okay, for the next slide, my friend Putri Carbelani will explain it.
Okay, knowledge of English among the upper class. The use of French was not confined to persons of origin extraction, but that all those who were brought into association with the governing class soon acquired a command of it. It was mark of social distinction. On the other hand, the fact that English was the language of the greater part of the population made it altogether likely that many of the upper class will acquire some familiarity with it. Such appears to have been the case at least by the 12th century. This period is direct knowledge of English was not uncommon at the end of the 12th century. Among those who habitually use French, that among churchmen and men of education, it was even to be expected, and that among those whose activities brought them into contact with both upper and lower classes, the ability to speak both languages was quite general. And the next is knowledge of French among the middle class. If by the end of the 12th century a knowledge of English was not unusual among members of the highest class, it seems equally clear that the knowledge of French was often found somewhat farther down in the social scale. Among the knightly class, French seems to be have cultivated, even the mother tongue was English. Next to the knights, the inhabitants of towns probably contain the largest number of the among the middle class who knew French. In many towns, especially in important trading centers, men with Norman names were the most prominent burgesses and probably constituted a majority of the merchant class. I think that's all from me.
Okay, I think that's all from our group, from our presentation. Thank you for watching this video till the end, and we hope that the information and you get new knowledge. And see you.